Competition for gas. Greece, Cyprus and Israel sign a pipeline deal in the eastern Mediterranean. But Turkey is also expanding its influence there. So will this deal fuel the rivalry? And how is it shaping politics in the region? This is Inside Story. Hello there, very warm welcome to the programme. I'm Julie MacDonald. Worldwide demand for natural gas is growing and discoveries in the eastern Mediterranean are changing the EU's policies on its energy supplies. For decades it's relied on Russia for gas, but Israel, Greece and Cyprus have signed off on a project for a pipeline that would lessen Europe's dependence on Moscow. Well, the supply will connect Israel's offshore fields with Europe and is expected to meet about 10% of the EU's demand for natural gas. But that unites the three signatories in opposition to Turkey and Libya. Last month, Ankara and Tripoli agreed a new maritime boundary that they call their exclusive economic zone. They say this gives them full rights to exploit natural resources in the eastern Mediterranean, and that includes oil and gas. Well, let's have a closer look at the East Med gas pipeline. It'll link Cyprus and Israel's Levantine basin offshore gas reserves to Greece and then to Italy, and it will bypass Turkey. Well, meanwhile, Turkey is deploying soldiers to Libya to back the UN-recognised government in Tripoli, and that's fighting forces loyal to warlord Khalifa Haftar. Ankara says its troops will protect its rights in the Mediterranean and its interests in Libya. Well, the war has escalated in recent weeks, and Haftar declared in December what he called a final and decisive battle for the capital. He's been trying to seize the city since April. Libya has been torn by violence and conflict since the fall of longtime ruler Muammar Gaddafi back in 2011. Well, let's bring in our guests. Gabriel Mitchell is a policy fellow at the Mitvim Institute think tank. He joins us by Skype from West Jerusalem. Mehmet Ojukwu, who is chairman of the London Energy Club and a former Turkish diplomat. He joins us from London. James Moran is an associate senior research fellow at the Centre for European Policy Studies and former EU ambassador to Egypt. He joins us from Brussels. A very warm welcome to each of you, gents. So what does all of this mean? I want to kick off with you, Mehmet, to help us unpick this potentially deeply complex situation. From your perspective, how realistic is this pipeline project, given the Turkish opposition?
Well, I don't think it's only related to Turkish opposition. If you look at the merits of such a pipeline, of course, there is a great value in bringing another gas corridor to Europe. In addition to what we have, Russia, North Africa, Norway, FSRU, US LNG. So there's going to be gas-to-gas competition coming from different sources. If this new pipeline will bring gas, which is affordable, cost competitive to other ones, and it also overcome this geopolitical tensions, which might hamper the progress in this project. Of course, it's a very welcome new addition to European gas stock. Also, you have to bear in mind that in transition to low-carbon economy in Europe, there are going to be significant challenges for new gas to be brought to the European markets. There isn't also a strong appetite for new infrastructure, pipeline infrastructure to be built. Don't forget that we have now TAP, which will bring gas from Caspian through Turkey, Greece to Italy, which has already been signed and progressed, and the gas was brought all the way to the Turkish border. When TAP is completed, this will carry gas to Italy. Then you have Turk Stream 2, which will bring gas via Bulgaria all the way to Baumgarten. And then you have Nord Stream 2 under the Baltic Sea, bringing gas to Central Europe. So there is an abundance of gas supplies coming. Then the question will be, of course, how realistic is to have some additional gas, at what price, and also geopolitically complex situation, whether this will constitute any risk. So also financing will be a huge hurdle, because EBRD, European Investment Bank, they made clear that they are not going to fund natural gas projects in the future. So there are so many complex issues at hand, and I hope that this will be resolved and this pipeline project will go smoothly. And don't also forget an example that we had in the past. Nabucco project started in 2002, abandoned in 2013, then transformed into TANAP. The lessons that we learned from such pipelines, you can sign all this intergovernmental agreement, MOUs, and whatever you have, but the realization is very, very, very difficult. You need a very strong lead country. In this case, I don't see who will be the lead country. Is it going to be Italy, which will be absent in the meeting today, signing intergovernmental agreement in Athens? What about Egypt? Egypt is against this pipeline, as far as I can see, because it wants to be the main hub for gas exports from the region. And then, of course, US and EU are supporting it, but whether they are going to put also financial capital behind this project in addition to political capital. Then the agreement signed between Turkey and Libya, Tripoli-based government, about the maritime boundaries and military cooperation, skirting the exclusive economic zone and also continental rights of Crete, which is in the middle of this pipeline. So these are a lot of question marks that spring to mind. And
Mehmet, I'm going to stop you there just for a second. We'll definitely get to all of those question marks, but I want to bring in Gabriel Mitchell at this point. Gabriel, I've heard it said by an analyst that this particular deal smells of gas, but it stinks of geopolitics, which I thought was an interesting turn of phrase. From Israel's perspective, what does it stand to gain from this deal?
Well, what we're talking about is the 7th summit between Israeli, Cypriot, and Greek heads of state in the last 2.5 years. So first and foremost, we're talking about a political process, a diplomatic process that even over the course of the last 2.5 years has roots that go back nearly a decade. So from an Israeli perspective, geopolitics is perhaps the ultimate prize. Prime Minister Netanyahu gave an address last night to the Israeli public, in which he was talking about efforts to create immunity for himself from any kind of criminal charges. But in his speech, he spoke about how he would be going to Athens in order to secure a gas deal that would reward Israelis with billions upon billions of dollars. Now, I agree with a lot of what Mehmet said, that ultimately we're talking about an MOU between the political parties, but not between commercial actors. And certainly it needs to check off technical feasibility boxes, not to mention the commercial ones. So Netanyahu's, I think, his framing is about economics, about commercial opportunities, but everything about this process right now is geopolitical. And it can't be ignored, nor can the in the room, which is Turkey, who is not a party of these conversations and hasn't been a primary actor in these processes, but nonetheless is present, even if those 3 states would prefer it not being there.
James Moran, past and present rivalries, are they turning gas discoveries into a new bone of contention, and are they fostering division rather than cooperation? How do you see things?
Well, it is certainly a case of the Wild East, if you want to put it that way, given the tangled web of interests between the different parties. But I think, as Mehmet was saying, there is quite a strong common interest between the suppliers and the consumers here. I mean, the EU has already put money into the project. Almost $40 million went into feasibility studies. He's right to point out the problems down the line in terms of the finance of the infrastructure itself, and that will be a challenge. But there's no doubt that there is a common interest there. What's lacking is some sort of regional multilateral forum to bring the different parties together. There is, in fact, one initiative which I just want to point out, which is the East Med Gas Forum, which was formed about a year ago, which is headquartered in Cairo, and includes 6 of the parties, doesn't include Lebanon, and of course Turkey hasn't joined. But nevertheless, that sort of organization could be perhaps used to bring out the different contradictions of interest and so forth, and keep the eye on the prize, which is without question, for Europe anyway, diversification of supplies, and hopefully a contribution in the longer run to greater stability in the region?
Mehmet, I want to look now at the situation in Libya. We know that Turkey's parliament is sending troops to Libya to protect, as it sees it, its rights in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's obviously recently signed that maritime boundaries agreement with Libya. But how much of a gamble is that for Turkey, and what implications does it have?
Well, I think one thing is quite clear. Turkey feels being ignored, sidelined, excluded in the bigger East Mediterranean game. And this seven-nation East Mediterranean Natural Gas Forum, for example, doesn't include Turkey. But if you look at the picture on a very objective basis, Turkey is the largest country in East Med to reckon with by virtue of its economy, military, cultural hinterland, and energy consumption and transportation lines, whatever you look at it. And it is also the longest coastal line in East Med. And if you exclude Turkey in the equation in East Med, I don't think how many countries exist there, doesn't matter much. It's going to fail this way or another. It will never lead to any collaboration or settlement of the disputes. You will always have tension and confrontation. So one way to make it a win-win situation for all coastal countries in the region is to have a meaningful dialogue. Because if you include Turkey in this equation, and then things might work better, because Turkey is also after securing low-cost natural gas for its own supply. It's one of the largest markets in Europe, about 48 to 50 BCM of gas consumption per year coming from Russia, Iran, Azerbaijan, FSRU, LNG, US LNG as well, you name it. Therefore, it is difficult, but we need to depoliticize this issue a little bit, because there is a perception in Ankara that there is a sort of a evil front, in quotation marks, against Turkey, formed by Israel, Egypt, Cyprus, Greece, and also supported by Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. So this creates a sort of a cleavage in the region against which Turkey is trying to struggle and make room for itself. And the agreement with the government, legitimate government in Tripoli, is a sign that Turkey is changing the game, making some waves. I agree that there are some serious difficulties, especially in terms of skirting Crete from this picture, which I believe by international law it has its own rights. But Turkey, I think, has done a maximalist approach in terms of bringing itself to the picture and then making statements, especially President Erdogan made a number of statements, which also surprised me, saying that we are open to discussion, dialogue, negotiations on that. So I think at this stage, if you ignore this Turkish approach, we like it or not, but only focus on what these 3-4 countries can do together, I think all the efforts, unfortunately, no matter what support it will get from US or EU, will be bound to fail. So Libya and also Turkish determination to send to Libya military advisors, support technicians, and logistical support, whatever you name it, and will be the beginning of a quite dangerous gambit in that country, because the opposition forces, General Haftar, and supported by another opposing camp, and so this way, a NATO member country, Turkey, will be opposing a couple of other NATO member countries and their regional countries. So this means spreading the risks and tension and conflict from Syria to East Med and then to Libya. So I think there is an urgent need for these major powers to sit down and find a way to overcome these difficulties. Otherwise, my concern is that this is going to explode in such a way that we may not be able to control. It is not going to be in the interest of anybody. It's not also time to exchange blames, who is to blame for this or that.
I want to bring in James Moran at this stage. Hang on just 2 seconds, Mehmet. I just want to bring in James Moran, because I can see you nodding there, James. So we've got a situation on the ground, as Mehmet just outlined there, which is potentially explosive in Libya. And we have a situation where Turkey will be giving support in several ways, but it will also, to some degree, be facing off against Egypt. I mean, in regional terms, that's a real tinderbox, isn't it?
Yes, and it's been that way for far too long. You can't blame, frankly, the legitimate government in Tripoli, the internationally recognized government in Tripoli of Sarraj, for doing what it's done with Turkey. They do feel isolated when it comes to support, security support. And one of the problems, frankly, has been the lack of a common position in Europe, which has a huge interest in trying to calm down the situation. And there, with the new leadership coming in now here in Brussels, I think one of the greatest challenges they have in the southern neighborhood of the European Union is to bang some heads together, in particular in Paris and Rome, France and Italy, who have been on opposing sides in Libya for quite some time now, even if they give lip service to the United Nations process. But to bring these two major member states together and to forge a common position to support the United Nations-led process, leading to some stability, hopefully long-term stability in that blighted country. Sooner that's done, the better. And that might also take the pressure off the government there and the other parties too, not to turn to agreements of the kind that they've just forged with Turkey. Second thing I want to say, and I agree with Mehmet, none of these projects are going to be successful in the longer run unless efforts are made not to isolate Turkey. Turkey is a player. There's no question about that in the Eastern Mediterranean. And again, it's understandable that they feel a little bit isolated in this story. So I think there too, another challenge for the new leadership here in Brussels is to try to find a way forward on easing the tensions in the relationship with Turkey. And the EU does need to tread carefully. At the end of the day, Turkey is an absolutely key partner, not least on migration. And of course, it is still a candidate for membership in the much longer run, even if with the Erdogan administration that is not so easy at the moment. But ways need to be found to keep Turkey on board. But right now, the challenge is to get behind the UN process in Libya to provide a longer-term, stable settlement in that country. And to do that, I think, is at the top of the agenda for the EU.
Gabriel Mitchell, from everything that I'm hearing here, there is a certain amount of common sense and pragmatism to keeping Turkey on side. Does Israel believe that that's important, or is it a priority right now?
I think that the Israeli position is that the door has always been open for Turkish participation in any kind of regional processes. And I do think that there is the very basic architecture for some kind of regional forum. As Ambassador Moran mentioned, the East Med Gas Forum is perhaps the most basic rubric, but an important starting point for regional dialogue, not only on energy issues, but all different kinds of issues that can bring the East Med parties together. At the same time, from the Israeli perspective, there are clear red lines that it has seen engage in, particularly in violation of what it sees as the rights or the interests of other regional parties and partners, specifically Cyprus and Greece. Israel has had a better relationship with Turkey in the past. We don't have to go into all of the particulars, but the bottom line is that energy cooperation was, at the very least, rhetorically, one of the primary reasons used for reconciliation between Israel and Turkey in 2016. And in 2017, 2018, negotiations about a potential gas pipeline fell through, at least in theory, over price, but I assume that there were some political concerns as well. It is what it is, right? Ambassador Moran mentioned that Turkey is still, at least in theory, an EU candidate. I think we should all be realistic and say that, if we're talking about the Erdogan government, then we're talking about a government that oftentimes prefers having a type of combative relationship with a lot of neighboring countries. That includes Israel, but it obviously includes other East Med countries as well. Cyprus, Egypt, Greece, and of course the European Union. So avoiding or finding some kind of middle ground on the political issues is challenging so long as President Erdogan is in power and so long as he has an interest in finding foreign issues to distract his domestic base.
James Moran, I want to know more about where Egypt stands in all of this. We mentioned that it wants to be a gas hub in the region. So where does it stand?
Well, I know that Egypt is not very keen on the East Med pipeline. It sees it as some sort of competition to its own aspirations to be a major hub, energy hub in the region. I'm not entirely sure that that is the correct analysis. I think there are complementary aspects to all of this. After all, if Egypt is going to be exporting to the European market, it will not be through pipelines. They will do it through liquefied LNG and the rest. And it's not for now because the domestic needs in Egypt are enormous, and it will be some years before Egypt can become a major exporter herself. Egypt is also, I think, in a difficult position vis-à-vis Libya, where it's certainly been giving support, if not officially, then certainly through the back door, to Haftar's forces in the east of the country, and finds itself, I think, up against problems in that country. Understandably so, they have an interest because of the enormous border, long border between the two countries. I think Egypt finds itself in a rather nuanced position. It's also, though, a member of the East Med Gas Forum, and of course, which is headquartered in Cairo. So Egypt is participating in this early multilateral process, and I think, as Gabriel, I think, mentioned there, that could actually be the seed of something a little bit more productive and constructive going forward. And Egypt will have a role to play in that.
Mehmet, I want to ask you, will economic pragmatism across these old historic rivalries, boundaries and borders, can it prevail?
Well, we cannot wait for the political troubles, disputes and impasse to go away before we launch any commercial project. And I believe that not only in East Med case, but also many other pipeline projects, unfortunately, they are not becoming sort of an instrument for peace building and also, win-win propositions. Wherever you look in the world, and such resource development, sharing, transportation cause frictions, tensions. And our hope that in East Med, despite all these difficulties, whether the commercial economic realities could prevail. From that perspective, I think the option of bringing Cypriot as well as Israeli and Greek gas through Turkey to an existing infrastructure, TANAP and then TAP continuing to Europe or Turk Stream 2, will be economically more feasible. But I recognize that given the current circumstances in which Turkey doesn't have a diplomatic relationship now with Cairo and have great difficulties with Netanyahu government in Tel Aviv, and then Cyprus dispute continues, it's quite difficult to do this right away. But still, I'm optimistic that with some overtures coming from other regional countries in such a way that Turkey is not antagonized or cornered, and it will be seen as part of one of the major partners in this game, buying natural gas from the region, investing in it, facilitating in it, and then also, if equitable, as well as based on international law, sharing of the maritime resources and boundaries in the region, I think could be a step forward. So we need a positive spillover effect there. Otherwise, my concern is that economic benefits, realities, commercial interests may be sidelined, and we will have the hard facts, like gunboat diplomacy that we saw Turkey is exercising, feeling that there is no other instrument in its hand. So I strongly believe that there is still a ray of hope in East Med for parties to come around the same table, because such projects, as you know, doesn't happen from today to tomorrow. And it takes sometimes decades, as we have seen in the case of Nabucco and TANAP and Nord Stream, Turk Stream. It will take a long time. And it is not also related to Erdogan or whoever, Netanyahu or Mitsotakis. It is to stay at least half a century in place. Therefore, there has to be sound basis for such infrastructure to be built and operated.
Gents, I'm going to have to stop our discussion there, despite the fact that I've learned a lot. Let's hope that economic pragmatism does prevail. Thank you so much, gents, for joining me with your thoughts. Thanks to all of our guests, Gabriel Mitchell, Mehmet Oguchu and James Moran. And thank you, of course, to you for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, of course, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Julie McDonald, and the whole team here, bye-bye for now.